What if the person who taught you to dream also made you promise never to chase those dreams? Elena's hands trembled as she turned the pages of her father's atlas, dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light filtering through the Prague apartment windows. She was 58 years old, and she had just buried her mother 3 weeks ago. The apartment still smelled of illness, antiseptic and stale air, and something else, something bitter that had seeped into the wallpaper over 35 years. Her father's atlas sat on the dining table, rescued from a box her sister Marie had marked trash. Elena had almost let it go. Almost. But then she'd opened it. The maps were covered in her father's handwriting, small, precise notes in faded blue ink along the margins. Istanbul, spice markets, cats on every corner, call to prayer at dawn. Lisbon, streets too steep for cars, pastels de nata, light like honey. Morocco, blue cities, mint tea, silence of the desert. Places he'd dreamed of, places he'd researched, places he'd never seen. Her father died when Elena was 23, sudden and absolute, a heart attack in the middle of grading student papers. He'd been a geography teacher, the kind who made even landlocked students dream of oceans, the kind who spread maps across the kitchen table on Sunday mornings and traced routes with his coffee-stained fingers, telling her about trade winds and ancient caravan paths and cities built on volcanic islands. He'd made the world seem vast and possible. And then he was gone. 2 months after his funeral, Elena's mother had called her into the bedroom that would become a prison for them both. "I need you," her voice said, sharp even then, before the illness had legitimate claim to her bitterness. "Your sisters have their own lives, their own families, but you understand duty." Elena understood, or thought she did. That was 1991. The Berlin Wall had just fallen. The world was opening up, borders dissolving, possibilities multiplying, and Elena had closed the door to her mother's apartment and locked herself inside. Now, 35 years later, she sat alone in the same apartment, staring at her father's dreams rendered in careful handwriting, and something inside her cracked open like ice in spring. She'd never married, never had children, never traveled farther than Brno for her cousin's wedding. She'd worked part-time at the neighborhood library, the kind of small, cramped place that smelled like old paper and heating oil, where the same 12 people came in every week for the same predictable books. She'd spent her mornings changing her mother's bedpans and her afternoons reshelving romance novels about women who lived audacious lives. She'd spent her evenings preparing bland meals and listening to her mother's litany of complaints about the neighbors, the weather, the government, Elena's inadequacies as a daughter, the unfairness of a body that had betrayed her. Her mother had been 56 when she'd taken to bed, some nebulous spinal condition that 3 doctors couldn't quite diagnose and 2 had suggested might be primarily psychological. But her mother had insisted she couldn't walk, couldn't work, couldn't function, and Elena, young and dutiful and desperate to honor her father's memory by caring for the woman he'd loved, had believed her. Or maybe she'd just been too afraid to call it a lie. The apartment was silent now in a way it had never been when her mother was alive. No television blaring, no bell ringing from the bedroom, that goddamn bell her mother had used to summon Elena at all hours. No voice calling her worthless, ungrateful, selfish, whenever Elena had dared to suggest maybe we could hire a part-time nurse, maybe Elena could take a weekend trip, maybe there was still time for Elena to have her own life. "You promised," her mother would say, her eyes hard and bright. "You promised you'd never leave me." Elena had made that promise when she was 23 and drowning in grief, and convinced that promises to the dying were sacred, immutable things. She'd made it before she understood that some promises are chains disguised as love. She turned another page of the atlas. Norway. Her father had drawn a star next to Tromsø and written, "Northern Lights, September through March, Aurora Borealis," from the Latin, Dawn of the North. Elena would love this. Elena would love this. The words hit her like a fist to the sternum. He'd been planning to take her. Before he died, before everything fell apart, he'd been mapping out a trip. Father and daughter, geography teacher and his star pupil. He'd taught her to read topographical maps when she was 7, to calculate distances using scale bars when she was 9, to understand longitude and latitude and the way the world curved and folded and revealed itself in layers. He'd taught her that maps were invitations, that every line represented a possibility, that the world was there for the exploring. And she'd spent 35 years in 3 rooms. Her body ached as she stood, joints protesting. Her back hurt constantly now, a deep, grinding pain from decades of lifting her mother from bed to chair to toilet and back again. Her shoulders were permanently rounded. Her hands were stiff in the mornings. She looked in the mirror and saw an old woman, though she was only 58. Not old in modern standards, but old in the ways that mattered, in experience, in joy, in living. She'd become her mother, not in bitterness, not quite, but in absence, a ghost in her own life. The thought terrified her more than anything else. Elena walked to the window and looked out on the Prague street below. October twilight, the street lamps just beginning to glow orange. A young couple walked past, laughing, their breath visible in the cooling air. A tram rumbled by, headed somewhere, everywhere, anywhere. The apartment felt like a tomb. Her sisters had come to the funeral, of course, Marie and Jana, both younger, both married with children, both living their own lives in their own cities. They'd stood on either side of Elena at the graveside, stiff and formal, and they'd left immediately after, barely speaking to her. There'd been tension for years. Her mother had made sure that, playing the daughters against each other, feeding resentments, hoarding Elena's attention and martyrdom like currency. At the lawyer's office, reading the will, Marie looked at Elena with something like contempt. Of course she left you the apartment. You earned it, didn't you? 35 years of servitude. Jana had been quieter, but no less cold. What will you do now? Finally live a little, or are you too comfortable playing the saint? Elena hadn't known how to answer. She'd spent so long being the dutiful daughter that she didn't know who she was without that identity. The thought of freedom was terrifying. What do you do with yourself when the cage door opens and you've forgotten how to fly? But sitting there now, atlas open, her father's handwriting speaking to her across decades, something shifted. She could sell the apartment. It was worth something. Not much, but enough. Enough for what, she wasn't sure yet, but enough to matter. Her sisters would be furious. They'd expected her to give them each a share, compensation for their years of absence somehow. But the will was clear. The apartment was Elena's. Her mother's final gift, though it felt more like a test. What would you do with freedom if I gave it to you? Elena spent that entire night reading the atlas cover to cover. Not just the maps, but every margin note, every scribbled observation, every dreamed-of destination. Her father had been methodical. He'd researched train routes and budget accommodations and seasonal weather patterns. He'd calculated costs. He'd planned itineraries. He'd been a teacher's salary, not wealthy, but he'd been careful, strategic. He believed travel was possible for anyone who wanted it badly enough. And he believed Elena would want it. The next morning, she called a real estate agent. 3 weeks later, she found the journal.
It was tucked inside the atlas, a small leather notebook she'd somehow missed in her first frantic reading, her father's journal. She'd never known he kept one. The entries were sporadic, years between some, but they painted a picture of a man who'd dreamed deeply and quietly, who'd postponed and postponed until postponement became permanence. The last entry was dated 2 days before he died. Elena is 23 now, graduated, working at the library. Not what I'd hoped for her, but she seems happy enough. Her mother worries she's too bookish, too solitary, but I see myself in her. The way she studies maps, the way she asks questions about places she's never been. I taught Elena to read maps so she could go everywhere I couldn't. I think when she's ready, when the time is right, she'll understand that. I hope I'm there to see it. I hope I'm there to watch her become the person she's meant to be, not confined by this city, by expectations, by fear. She has a curious heart. That's the best gift I could have given her. Elena read the words 3 times. 4. 5. I taught Elena to read maps so she could go everywhere I couldn't. She'd spent 35 years honoring her mother's fear and bitterness, thinking it was duty, thinking it was love. But what about her father? Where was the honor in betraying his dreams for her, in becoming small and confined when he'd wanted her expansive and brave? Staying home honored no one. Not her mother, whose unhappiness would have existed regardless. Not her father, who died hoping she'd live large. Not herself. The apartment sold faster than expected. The buyer was a young family, eager, willing to pay cash. Elena's sisters called her selfish, greedy, cruel. Jaina sent long, wounded text messages about betrayal and disrespect to their mother's memory. Elena didn't answer. She was too busy being terrified because she'd bought a train ticket, Prague to Vienna, departure November 3rd, 1 week away. It was only a 4-hour trip, a nothing trip, a beginning, and she couldn't breathe when she thought about it. The panic attacks had started 3 years ago, mild at first, then escalating. The first time she'd been at the library, shelving books, when her heart started racing for no reason, her chest constricting, the walls pressing in. She thought she was dying. The doctor had said anxiety, agoraphobia. Understandable given her circumstances. 35 years of confinement would do that to a person. He'd offered medication. She'd refused because how could she take pills when her mother needed alert and present? Now her mother was gone, and the panic attacks were worse. The thought of stepping outside sometimes paralyzed her. The grocery store 3 blocks away felt like a marathon. The idea of a train to another country felt impossible, but she'd bought the ticket anyway. November 3rd arrived cold and gray. Elena stood in her empty apartment. She'd sold or donated almost everything, keeping only a single backpack of clothes and her father's atlas and journal. The new family would take possession tomorrow. She had a hostel booked in Vienna for 2 nights. After that, she had no plan. Just the atlas, just her father's dreams, just a terror so profound she thought it might kill her. The walk to the train station took 20 minutes. She had to stop 4 times, leaning against buildings, trying to remember how to breathe. People passed her without looking. The world moved on, indifferent to her private catastrophe. She made it to the platform. The train was already there, sleek and modern, doors open. Other passengers were boarding casually, as if this were nothing, as if crossing borders were ordinary. Elena stood frozen. Her hands were shaking, her vision was narrowing, the edges going dark and sparkly, the way they did before she fainted. She couldn't move, couldn't step forward. The train doors would close and she'd still be standing here, and she'd go back to the apartment, except there was no apartment anymore, and she'd have failed before she'd even started. The conductor called a warning, doors closing in 1 minute. Elena thought about her father, about maps spread on kitchen tables, about his careful handwriting. Elena would love this. She stepped onto the train. The doors closed behind her. She collapsed into a seat, heart hammering, tears streaming down her face. The train pulled away from the platform, and Prague disappeared behind her, and Elena pressed her forehead against the window and shook with something between terror and exhalation. She'd done it. She was moving. She was leaving. The panic attack lasted 40 minutes. Somewhere between Prague and Brno, a woman across the aisle offered her a bottle of water and a kind smile, but didn't intrude. She drank the water and focused on breathing, and didn't die, though she was certain she would. By the time they reached the Czech-Austrian border, her hands had steadied. By the time they pulled into Vienna's Hauptbahnhof, she was breathing almost normally. She'd made it. Vienna was overwhelming in ways Prague never was. Bigger, busier. The hostel was in the 7th district, a 20-minute walk from the station, and Elena got lost 3 times trying to find it despite having a map. The streets twisted unexpectedly. The language shifted, German instead of Czech, though she spoke neither fluently. People moved faster here, purposeful, and she felt ancient and slow by comparison. The hostel was called Wombats, Backpacker Central, the website had said, cheap, clean, social. Elena had chosen it because it was affordable and because the idea of a sterile hotel room alone terrified her as much as crowds did. At least at a hostel, there'd be people, witnesses if she fell apart completely. She shared her room with 5 others, 2 Australian girls in their 20s traveling together, a German man in his 40s on business, and a young American couple on their honeymoon doing Europe on a shoestring. They were all friendly in that casual, transient way of travelers. They asked where she was from, where she was going. She answered vaguely. They didn't press. By 10 p.m., they were all asleep or out exploring the city's nightlife. Elena lay in her narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling and listened to strangers breathing and thought, I did it. I'm here. I survived. She spent 2 days in Vienna, barely leaving the hostel's immediate neighborhood. She walked to a nearby cafe and drank coffee that cost too much. She visited a small museum of clocks because it was close and unthreatening. She sat in the Berg Garden and watched people and tried to feel something other than numb terror. On the 3rd morning, she was supposed to check out. She'd booked a hostel in Bratislava next, another short trip, building incrementally. But when she tried to pack her bag, her hands wouldn't cooperate. Her chest tightened. The familiar darkness crept into her vision. She couldn't get on another train. Not yet. Not today. She extended her stay at the hostel for another week, then another. She got a job washing dishes at the cafe down the street. They paid cash, under the table, and didn't ask questions. It wasn't much, but it stretched her money. She told herself she was just pausing, regrouping. She'd move on soon. But weeks became a month, and she was still in Vienna, still in the same 6-block radius, still trapped. One evening, sitting in the hostel common area nursing a beer she didn't really want, a man sat down across from her. Middle-aged, salt-and-pepper beard, kind eyes. He said, "You've been here a while," in German-accented English. "Is that a problem?" Elena asked, defensively. No, just an observation. Most people pass through. You seem," paused, searching for the word, "stuck." Elena laughed bitterly. That's one way to put it. His name was Klaus. He ran the hostel. And over the next hour, without her quite meaning to, Elena told him everything. About her mother, about the 35 years, about her father's atlas, about the promise she'd made and broken, about the panic attacks, about how she'd made it to Vienna and then stopped, frozen, unable to move forward or back.
Klaus listened without judgment. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My wife had agoraphobia after our daughter died. She couldn't leave the house for 2 years. You know what helped?" Elena shook her head. Small steps, but also giving herself permission to fail. She'd planned to walk to the corner. Some days she'd make it. Some days she wouldn't. She'd try again. Eventually, the trying mattered more than the succeeding. Eventually, she got farther. He smiled sadly. She died 5 years ago, cancer. But those last 3 years, after she'd worked through the agoraphobia, she traveled more than anyone I've known. She said every trip was a gift. Every moment outside her own head was grace. Elena felt tears welling. I don't know if I can. Klaus said, "You made it to Vienna. That's not nothing." The next morning, she tried again. She packed her bag. She walked to the train station. She bought a ticket. Not to Bratislava, not to anywhere from her father's atlas. To Istanbul. It was insane. It was impossibly far. It was a 24-hour journey with connections, and she'd barely managed 4 hours from Prague to Vienna. But something in her had snapped into clarity. If she kept taking tiny, safe steps, she'd spend the rest of her life in half measures. Her mother had done that, lived small, chosen fear, blamed everyone else. Elena was done choosing fear. She got as far as the platform before the panic hit. Worse this time. Her vision whited out. She couldn't feel her hands. She sank onto a bench, gasping, certain this was it. This was a heart attack. This was death. A teenager sat down next to her. Couldn't have been more than 17. Headphones around his neck, skateboard at his feet. "First time flying?" he asked in English. Elena couldn't speak, just shook her head. "My mom gets panic attacks," he said conversationally. "She says it helps to name 5 things you can see. Wanna try?" Elena tried. Bench, train, clock, man with newspaper, pigeon. Good. 4 things you can touch. Bench, backpack, jacket, her own trembling hands. 3 things you can hear. Train announcement, her own heartbeat, the kids' breathing. 2 things you can smell. Coffee, diesel. 1 thing you can taste. Copper, fear, her own blood from biting her lip. The panic didn't disappear, but it receded. Enough. Barely enough. "Thanks," Elena managed. The kid shrugged. "Good luck with whatever you're doing. Looks scary. Must be important." He skated off, and Elena sat there thinking, yes, it's important. She got on the train. The journey to Istanbul was a blur of panic and exhaustion and strange, sharp moments of unexpected beauty. Somewhere in Hungary, the countryside opened up, vast fields and distant mountains, and sky that went on forever. She pressed her face to the window and cried, not from fear, but from something else, something that felt almost like relief. In Bulgaria, she shared a compartment with a woman and her young daughter. They spoke no English, and Elena spoke no Bulgarian, but they shared bread and cheese and smiled at each other, and it was enough. At the Turkish border, Elena's hands shook as she showed her passport. The official stamped it without looking up. Routine for him, monumental for her. When the train finally pulled into Istanbul's Sirkeci station, Elena stepped onto the platform and immediately got swept up in a crowd. The noise was overwhelming. Turkish, Arabic, English, German, languages she couldn't even identify. The air smelled like diesel and spices, and salt water and humanity. It was chaos. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. She found her hostel, a small place in Sultanahmet, walking distance from the Blue Mosque. The owner was a woman named Ayşe, probably in her 60s, with shrewd eyes and a warm smile. She took one look at Elena and said, "First time in Istanbul?" "First time anywhere," Elena admitted. Ayşe nodded as if this made perfect sense. "I give you bottom bunk, easier, and tomorrow I show you where to get good tea, not tourist tea, real tea." That night, Elena lay in her bunk in another room full of strangers and listened to the call to prayer echoing across the city, that haunting, beautiful sound her father had written about. She pulled out his atlas and found his note, "Call to prayer at dawn." It was 5 a.m., dawn, exactly as he'd described. She whispered into the darkness, "I'm here, Dad. I made it." The next 3 weeks in Istanbul were a series of small apocalypses and even smaller victories. Some days, Elena couldn't leave the hostel. The panic would hit as soon as she stepped outside, and she'd retreat to her bunk, shaking and ashamed. Ayşe would bring her tea and sit with her and talk about nothing, her grandchildren, the weather, the stray cats that lived in the neighborhood.
"You don't have to conquer the world today," Aisha said once. "You just have to survive it. Tomorrow, maybe you try again." Other days, Elena managed to walk. She explored the neighborhood around the hostel, the small shops selling spices and carpets and lamps, the street vendors with their carts of simit and roasted chestnuts. She sat in a cafe and drank Turkish coffee so strong it made her hands shake worse than the panic did. She watched people and practiced breathing and tried to remember that being afraid didn't mean she was failing. One afternoon, she made it to the spice bazaar. The crowds were suffocating, the sensory overload almost unbearable. Mountains of spices in every shade of red and gold and brown, the air thick with scent, cumin and saffron and something smoky she couldn't name. Vendors called out to her in Turkish and English, "Come, look, best price, for you, my friend." She felt her chest constricting, the darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. But then a cat appeared, orange and scruffy, weaving between her legs, purring. She looked down at it, and the cat looked up at her with slitted, judging eyes, and Elena found herself laughing. Here she was on the verge of a panic attack in one of the world's great cities, and a cat was demanding attention. She bent down and scratched its ears. The panic receded. "Cats everywhere," her father had written. He'd been right. By the end of her third week, Elena could walk from the hostel to the Sultanahmet Square without stopping. She visited the Blue Mosque and stood in its vast blue tiled interior and felt small in a way that was comforting rather than terrifying. She took a ferry across the Bosphorus and watched Istanbul slip away on one side, Asia approach on the other, and thought about borders and how arbitrary they were, how easy to cross once you stopped letting them define you. Her last night, Aisha invited her to dinner in the hostel's small kitchen, just the two of them, a simple meal of lentil soup and bread. "Where next?" Aisha asked. Elena pulled out the atlas. "Lisbon, I think." Aisha raised her eyebrows. "Long journey. You ready?" "No," Elena said honestly, "but I don't think I'll ever feel ready. I think I just have to go."
Aisha smiled. Smart woman. Readiness is a myth. Courage is just fear that said its prayers and moved forward anyway. The flight to Lisbon was Elena's first time on a plane. She'd bought the ticket in a moment of defiant terror. Flying was faster and, bizarrely, cheaper than the train. The panic attack in the airport security line was so severe that a security officer pulled her aside, concerned. She'd managed to explain, somehow, that she was okay, just scared, just traveling for the first time. The officer, a woman about her age, had squeezed her hand. "My mother didn't get on a plane until she was 70, she said. Said it was the best thing she ever did. You've got this." Elena didn't have it, but she got on the plane anyway. Takeoff was a nightmare. She gripped the armrests so hard her knuckles went white. The man next to her, a businessman in an expensive suit, glanced over once and then pointedly ignored her, which Elena appreciated. She didn't need comfort, she needed to survive. But then they broke through the clouds, and the world below became abstract, patterns of land and sea, geometry and light, and Elena thought about her father's maps, about how he'd always said maps were a way of seeing the world from God's perspective, whole and interconnected, and beautiful in its complexity. From up here, her fear seemed small. Not gone, just smaller. Lisbon was light. That was Elena's first impression. The quality of the light was different than Prague or Vienna or Istanbul. Softer, golden. It reflected off the white and yellow buildings and made the whole city glow. Aisha had been right. The streets were steep, impossibly so. Trams clanked up and down hills at angles that seemed to defy physics. And everywhere there were these black and white mosaic sidewalks, intricate patterns that turned walking into a kind of meditation. Her money was running out. The apartment sale had given her a cushion, but months of hostels and meals and train tickets had eaten through it faster than she'd planned. She needed to work. But where? She was 58, spoke limited English and almost no Portuguese, had no legal right to work in Portugal. In other words, she was out of options. She found the bookshop by accident, wandering through Chiado one afternoon. It was small and crammed, English language books stacked floor to ceiling, the kind of place that smelled like old paper and coffee and possibility. A handwritten sign in the window, "Help wanted." Elena stood outside for 20 minutes, paralyzed. Then she went in. The owner was British, an expat named Margaret who'd moved to Lisbon in the 90s and never left. She was tall and angular and maybe 70, with short gray hair and bright red lipstick. She looked at Elena's resume, such as it was, and raised an eyebrow. Librarian in Prague, 35 years, then nothing, then suddenly you're in Lisbon? Elena said it's complicated. "I imagine," Margaret studied her. "You look terrified." "I am." "Good. Means you care. Can you start tomorrow?" The job paid barely anything, under the table, but it came with a room, a tiny space above the shop, more closet than bedroom, but private and free. Margaret didn't ask questions. She gave Elena tasks, shelving, inventory, manning the register when Margaret ran errands. The work was familiar, comforting. The shop attracted a steady stream of expats and travelers, people passing through, people staying. Elena listened to their stories, gap-year students and retirees and runaways and dreamers. She learned she wasn't the only one starting over. She stayed in Lisbon for 4 months, long enough to learn some Portuguese, enough to navigate the trams, enough to make friends at the small cafe where she drank her morning coffee, long enough to hike up to São Jorge Castle and look out over the terracotta roofs and the Tagus River and think, I live here now. Temporarily, but I live here. Long enough to stop thinking of Prague as home. One evening, Margaret asked her over wine and cheese in the shop's back room, "What made you leave Prague your whole life?" Elena told her about her mother, about the 35 years, about her father's atlas. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "My mother was like that too. Not bedridden, but demanding. She needed me for everything. Emotional support, financial support, someone to blame for her unhappiness. I left when I was 30, moved to Lisbon, and never looked back. She died angry at me, never forgave me for choosing myself." "Do you regret it?" Elena asked. "Not for a second, but I grieve what could have been if she'd been different, if she'd wanted my happiness instead of my servitude." Margaret refilled their glasses. "But here's the thing," Margaret said. "You're 58. You've probably got 30 more years if you're lucky, maybe 40. That's still a life. That's still a life." It was what Elena needed to hear. When spring came, she knew it was time to move on. She'd saved a little money, she'd regained a little strength. Her panic attacks were less frequent, though they still came, unpredictable and brutal, reminding her that healing wasn't linear. She hugged Margaret goodbye. "You gave me a life," Elena said. "I gave you a room," Margaret corrected. "You gave yourself a life." From Lisbon, she took buses and trains north, to Porto, where she walked across the Don Luis Bridge and felt the height and the river far below and didn't panic, or panicked but kept walking, to Galicia in Spain, where she hiked part of the Camino de Santiago, and her body screamed in protest but didn't break, to the Basque country, where she ate pinchos and drank ticoli and sat in a plaza and thought, "My father never imagined I'd be here, but I am." She made it to the French border in June. The plan, insofar as she had a plan, was to head to the Italian coast, Cinque Terre. Her father had drawn stars next to all 5 villages, hiking trails between them, cliffs and vineyards, sea like glass, must see. She'd resisted it for months. Hiking? Her body was 58 and broken. Her back ached constantly. Her knees were unreliable. She'd spent 35 years barely moving. But something in her wanted to try. The Cinque Terre trail between Monterosso and Vernazza was only 2 miles. The guidebook called it moderate. Elena called it brutal. The path was steep and rocky, clinging to cliff sides, climbing stone steps that seemed to go on forever. Her lungs burned, her legs trembled. She had to stop every few hundred feet to rest. Younger hikers passed her, barely breathing hard. A couple jogged by. Elena leaned against a stone wall and thought about turning back. But then she looked up. The trail ahead curved around the cliff, and beyond it she could see Vernazza, a small splash of colorful buildings tumbling down to a tiny harbor, the sea impossibly blue beyond. It was maybe a mile away, maybe less. She thought about her father, about all the places he'd mapped but never seen, about how he'd wanted this for her, not the pain or the struggle, but the trying, the willingness to push past what she thought was possible. She kept going. When she finally stumbled into Vernazza 2 hours later, sweaty and shaking and so exhausted she could barely stand, she bought a bottle of water and sat on the harbor wall and looked back at the trail she'd just hiked. She'd done it. Her broken, neglected 58-year-old body had carried her 2 miles over mountains and cliffs. She'd done it. She cried, not from pain or exhaustion, though there was plenty of both, but from something else, from the realization that her body was stronger than she'd believed, that she was stronger than she'd believed, that maybe it wasn't too late after all. From Italy, she drifted east, Slovenia, Croatia, places not in her father's atlas, but in her own imagination now. She was making her own maps. She stayed in small towns and big cities. She worked odd jobs when her money ran low, cleaning hostels, picking grapes on a vineyard, tutoring English to school kids in Split. She met other travelers. Most were younger, but not all. In Dubrovnik, she befriended a German couple in their 70s who'd sold their house and been traveling for 5 years. In Sarajevo, she shared a dorm room with a woman her own age from Brazil who'd left an abusive marriage and was, in her words, finding out who I am when I'm not scared. Elena understood that. In September, nearly a year after leaving Prague, Elena found herself in Morocco. Tangier first, then Chefchaouen, the blue city her father had marked with a star. The entire Medina was painted shades of blue, azure and cobalt and turquoise. Every wall, every doorway. It was like walking through a dream. She stayed in a riad run by a Moroccan family. The owner's mother, a woman in her 60s named Fatima, took an immediate interest in Elena. "You're traveling alone?" she asked in French. "At your age?" "Yes," Elena said, waiting for judgment. "Good," Fatima said firmly. "More women should." They fell into an easy companionship. Fatima taught Elena to make mint tea the proper way, lifting the pot high to create foam, pouring 3 times for luck. They sat on the rooftop terrace in the evenings and watched the sun set over the blue city, and Fatima told stories about her own life. Married at 16, 5 children, husband dead 10 years now. "I never traveled," she said. "I wanted to, but there was always a reason not to. Children, money, my husband's business. Then I was too old, too tired. Now I live through travelers like you." "You're not too old," Elena said. "I'm 58. I just started." Fatima laughed, but her eyes were sad. "Maybe in another life." The conversation haunted Elena. She recognized it, that resignation, that sense that the window had closed. She'd felt it herself for so long. The next day, she met Kenji. He was at the same hostel in Fez, a small place near the Medina walls. Elena was sitting in the courtyard journaling when an older man sat down nearby. Japanese, she guessed, though she'd learned not to assume. He was reading a worn paperback in English, Kerouac, on the road, and drinking mint tea. They didn't speak first, but the next morning they were both at breakfast early, and he nodded at her, and she nodded back, and somehow that turned into a conversation. His name was Kenji. He was 70 years old. He'd been a salaryman in Tokyo for 45 years. Long hours, dutiful work, the life expected of men of his generation. He retired 5 years ago, and his wife had died 6 months later.
Cancer, sudden and brutal. She always said we'd travel when I retired, Kenji said in careful accented English. But then there was no time, no chance. I'm sorry, Elena said. He nodded. Me too. But also, I decided I will not wait any more. I will see what she wanted to see. For both of us. How long have you been traveling? 4 years now. I sold our apartment. My children were angry, but, he shrugged, I am old. I earned this. They spent the day wandering Fez together, two older travelers moving slowly through the ancient Medina, getting lost in the labyrinth of alleys and souks. They shared a tagine at a small restaurant, and Kenji told her about Thailand and India and Turkey and all the places he'd been since leaving Tokyo. Elena told him about Prague and Vienna and Istanbul and her father's atlas. You carry him with you, Kenji observed. I suppose I do. This is good. The dead should travel too. That evening, sitting on the hostel rooftop watching the sun set over the Medina's endless chaos of roofs and minarets, Kenji said, When my wife died, I thought my life was over. I am 70. I am old. What is left? But traveling taught me age is just a number, a body. Inside, I am still the boy who dreamed of mountains. Inside, I am still alive. Elena felt something shift in her chest. She'd been so focused on the 35 lost years, the ways her mother had stolen her youth, the grief of time wasted. But what about the time she had now? What about the life still ahead? It's never too late, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. No, Kenji agreed. It is not. They parted ways 2 days later. He was heading to Marrakesh, she was heading north toward Spain, but the conversation stayed with her. She thought about her mother, about the bitterness that had consumed her, and she understood something she hadn't before. Her mother's unhappiness hadn't been about the illness, or the confinement, or even about being abandoned by her husband's death. It had been about choices. Her mother had chosen bitterness, had chosen to believe the world owed her something, had chosen to blame everyone else for her unlived life. Elena had almost made the same choice, had almost let her mother's death be the end of her own story, dutiful daughter forever defined by sacrifice and loss. But she'd chosen differently. She'd chosen the atlas, the trains, the panic attacks and the fear, and the hard, painful work of becoming someone new at 58. She'd chosen life. By October, nearly 1 full year after leaving Prague, Elena made it to Norway, Tromsø specifically, the city her father had starred. Elena would love this. She arrived in late September, the beginning of the aurora season. The hostel owner warned her, northern lights aren't guaranteed, could be cloudy, could be weak solar activity. Don't get your hopes up too high. But Elena had learned that hope was the only thing worth having. She spent 3 days in Tromsø, wandering the small Arctic city, visiting the Polar Museum, eating reindeer stew, watching the light change as autumn deepened towards winter. Each night she bundled up and walked outside the city center, looking up at the sky, waiting. The first 2 nights, nothing. Clouds, stars, but no aurora. The third night she almost didn't go. She was tired, her body ached from a day of walking, the temperature had dropped below freezing. What were the odds, really? But she went anyway, because what else was there to do but try? She walked to a small hill overlooking the fjord. It was maybe 10 p.m., dark and cold and silent except for the wind. She stood there, breath visible, looking up at a perfectly clear sky and thought, well, at least I tried. And then the sky moved. It started as a pale green shimmer, so faint she thought she was imagining it. Then it grew, waves of light, green and blue and violet, dancing across the sky like curtains in wind. It rippled and pulsed and shifted, and Elena stood there, 58 years old, freezing and alive, and watching her father's dream unfold above her. Aurora Borealis, dawn of the north. She thought about all the nights she'd spent in her mother's apartment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the television through the wall, feeling her life drain away minute by minute. She thought about the version of herself at 30, at 40, at 50, trapped, small, convinced it was too late. And she thought it was worth waiting for, all of it, even the pain, even the lost years, because they brought me here. She cried, but this time not from grief or fear, from joy, from the sheer, overwhelming beauty of being alive in this moment, in this place, with this sky. She stayed until the aurora faded, until her fingers were numb and her tears had frozen on her cheeks. Then she walked back to the hostel, and she pulled out her father's journal, and she wrote her own entry beneath his last words. I made it, Dad. I saw the northern lights. I hiked the cliffs. I crossed the borders you drew. I became the person you hoped I'd be. Thank you for teaching me to read maps. Thank you for believing I could go everywhere you couldn't. I wish you were here, but I carry you with me. Always. Elena didn't go back to Prague. There was nothing there for her anymore. She kept traveling, sometimes with purpose, sometimes with none. She returned to Lisbon for a month to visit Margaret. She went to Scotland and walked the Highlands. She took a ferry to the Greek islands and learned to swim at 59, awkward and terrified and exhilarated. Her siblings stopped calling. Eventually, they stopped being angry. Eventually, they just stopped caring. Elena grieved the loss of those relationships, but she didn't regret it. Some prices were worth paying. She made friends along the way, other travelers, other late bloomers, other people who decided that safety was overrated and fear was just another border to cross. She learned that community wasn't about where you lived, but who you chose to walk beside. Her body didn't get easier. The pain didn't disappear. She moved slowly, rested often, adapted, but she kept moving. On her 60th birthday, she was in a small village in the Azores, volunteering at a whale-watching center. The staff threw her a surprise party, a cake with Portuguese custard, wine from a local vineyard, people she'd known for all of 3 weeks singing happy birthday in English and Portuguese and broken French. One of the volunteers, a young woman from Belgium, asked her, "What's it like starting over so late?" Elena thought about it. Terrifying, honestly, painful, lonely sometimes, but also, she paused, searching for the right word, necessary, like breathing, like waking up after a long sleep. That night, alone in her small rented room, Elena opened her father's atlas one last time. She'd visited maybe a quarter of the places he'd marked. There were still so many left, but she'd added her own marks now, places he'd never dreamed of, places she'd discovered on her own. She realized the atlas wasn't a checklist, it was an invitation, a permission slip, a reminder that the world was vast and strange and full of beauty, and you didn't need anyone's blessing to explore it. You just needed courage, or maybe not even courage, just stubbornness, just the refusal to let fear have the final word. Elena closed the atlas and set it aside. She didn't need it anymore. She had her own maps now, drawn in experience and written in the language of a life finally lived. Outside her window, the Atlantic rolled and crashed against volcanic rocks, ancient and persistent, wearing away stone molecule by molecule, proving that even the hardest things eventually yield to patience and time. She thought, tomorrow I'll decide where to go next. Tonight, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And for the first time in 60 years, Elena knew what it felt like to be home, not in a place, but in herself, in motion, and the vast, terrifying, beautiful world her father had always known she'd love.